packet pushers.
Hey, everybody, and welcome to Packet Protector, the podcast at the intersection of networking and security. I'm JJ, here with Drew Connery Murray, and today we have an all-news episode because there has just been so much going on.
Yeah, we thought it was a good idea to just kind of dive in and do a bunch of news all at once. We've got some other interesting shows coming up. We're going to be talking about, in a future episode, architecting firewalls in the public cloud. JJ's putting together a series with some CISOs, so we'll get some CISO insights. But for today, it's going to be all news, and let's dive in. First, security researchers have discovered that attackers are exploiting a zero-day vulnerability in the management servers of SD-WAN provider Versa. Versa is used by ISPs and managed service providers, so compromising these management servers gives attackers a potential entry into multiple customers' environments. The researchers say the exploit lets the attackers intercept and harvest network access credentials. And it looks like the researchers are attributing this to Volt Typhoon, JJ.
Yeah, such cool names we have for these groups. I think we should probably start naming them something less exciting. But yeah, that's one of the Chinese state-sponsored groups that is always on the scene wreaking havoc, especially in MSPs.
Yeah. So the attackers are going after an exposed management port on the servers to exploit the vulnerability, and then they deploy a web shell. Remediations include upgrading the Versa management server software. Versa has made other remediation steps available to customers via its Versa support portal. I think one of the issues here, though, is that if you are using this as a managed service, you may not have access to do any kind of upgrades. So if you are a managed service customer of Versa, or just getting a service like this from your ISP and you're not sure who's providing it, you may want to ask some questions.
Yeah, and I'm hoping that the MSPs and whoever's managing this for you would already be aware of this. At this point, have already remediated it and then notified the customers. If you're not getting that type of communication, definitely poke them, call them, do what you need to do. This kind of reminds me, Drew, of, several weeks ago, we covered one of the stories with one of the Cisco management platforms. Similar situation, right? It might have even been Volt Typhoon in that one as well. So one of the platforms used to manage licensing, and I think to some degree configurations and connected for ISPs and managed service partners for Cisco equipment was under attack. And this is kind of a similar MO. And I think it just kind of proves that the state-sponsored activists or attackers, depending on what they're going after, really aren't going to stop. They're just going to keep finding different ways in, and they're targeting organizations through supply chain. And this is just one of those attacks. And it's a spray and pray sometimes, and other times it's quite calculated and surgical. I do think that Versa had put out some great hardening guidance. And I think there's a good takeaway from here is keep up with these things. If you're using a product like this, if there's anything that's internet facing or could be, get control over that. If nothing else in the environment, know what you have that's externally facing. Go seek out the hardening guides, even if they're not fed to you. And if you have opportunities for external pen testing, you certainly need to be doing that as well.
Yeah, for sure. I think obviously MSPs, service providers, anybody doing something on behalf of lots of customers is an appealing target to attackers because there's so much potential if you can actually break in and start stealing credentials for many, many, many customers as opposed to just getting one target.
Yeah. And I mean, frankly, the other piece, you ended that sentence and you said you're harvesting network access credentials. So in addition to just leveraging that pathway in, they're actually harvesting credentials, which brings up another attack vector, which is if your organization has any type of credential reuse, service account, shared admin or root accounts, you need to probably revisit that if you're using this technology.
Yeah. Sticking with vulnerabilities, Zyxel, they make switches, APs, and firewalls. They've announced a string of vulnerabilities across their product portfolio. The most pressing may be CVE 2024-7261, which has a CVSS score of 9.8 out of 10. It's an OS command injection vulnerability, and it's affecting multiple wireless APs and security routers. The vulnerability, quote, could allow an unauthenticated attacker to execute OS commands by sending a crafted cookie to a vulnerable device, end quote. There's also 7 vulnerabilities affecting some of the company's firewall models, and if exploited, they could enable DDoS attacks or allow an unauthenticated attacker to run OS commands and more. Some patches are available. Zyxel is a Taiwanese company that sells products via channel partners and service providers. I'm not sure how much of a penetration they have in the US, but they do have a US language website, and my assumption is they're selling into the SMB and education markets. So if you're in there, you might want to check that out.
Yeah, Zyxel is one of those names I don't hear often, or maybe I should say I haven't heard for a while, but I do throughout the years and decades of being in other people's environments. I will say that it was not terribly uncommon to find a Zyxel something that somebody had put in place.
Right.
Again, kind of ran down to whatever the local, technology store was. They picked it up and brought it back. Not necessarily enterprise IT, but kind of think about shadow IT or somebody in a department or a team that had some specific project, or It might have even been one of their contractors or managed service partners that came in and put this in place. So another opportunity here to just kind of do a sweep, because if you're reading this or hearing this and going, oh, well, we don't use that, you might, and you just might not know it because it did get dropped in by the third parties quite a bit.
Yes. The worst one is when you don't know that you have it. So,
Yeah, and it kinda sucks, when it's networking equipment like that, especially things that might be internet facing, and frankly, a lot of times that's when this type of thing got put in because, whoever was managing stuff. So, let me use an example here. Let's just forget all the normal IT stuff we usually think about. Let's say that the company has contracted with a service provider who's doing specific services related to some enterprise software, like maybe accounting functions or HR functions, and very often those organizations, which are not IT focused, will ship equipment in and tell somebody to plug it in so that they can get remote access or do something remotely.
mhm.
So that's the kind of stuff to look for, and I haven't had to look for this for a while, but, my guess is you could probably look up the OUIs to, like, go to Wireshark or somebody's webpage that has those MAC OUIs, those first parts of the MAC address will tell you who the manufacturer is. So there's some opportunity there to do a little lookup with, MAC addresses on the network.
That's right. Again, this is if you are using a channel partner or a service provider who's just taking care of stuff for you, you're not really sure what the equipment is. Another time, maybe you want to check on this just to be sure.
Mhm.
Moving on, Microsoft is going to host a Windows Endpoint Security Ecosystem Summit in September. And in fact, they'll be hosting it the day this episode comes out on September 10th. Microsoft is holding the summit with endpoint security vendors at their HQ in Redmond. The summit will include, quote, discussions about improving resiliency and protecting mutual customers' critical infrastructure. Our objective is to discuss concrete steps we will all take to improve security and resiliency for our joint customers. End quote. Microsoft has also invited government representatives to stave off threats of regulation. Excuse me, I mean to ensure transparency and collaboration.
True.
Oh, was I being
True.
cynical?
Oh, I do think bringing the regulators in is smart because how often is it we look at something from the outside and we go, "Well, hey, dumb dumb, why aren't you doing it this way?" Or these people are plain old idiots because they shouldn't be doing this or they should have been doing it that way. And it's really easy to look at it from the outside when we know nothing about what the inner workings of how these things actually happen. And I think the whole having third parties in the kernel in the Microsoft ecosystem versus not, then there's the whole, okay, the EU didn't let them for several years. There's just all of these other things that go into it
Mhm.
because the government regulators are playing a role. And we saw that with this last round with the CrowdStrike debacle. And so the question is, should these third party vendors have that type of persistence and access into the kernel or not? And pros and cons there need to be weighed. But the regulations from the EU were why Microsoft cited that they even were forced to do that in the first place.
Right. They sort of were trying to put the blame on those EU regulations that required them to open up the kernel to third parties because otherwise they wouldn't have allowed it. Yeah.
Well, yeah, because if you think about it as a software manufacturer, if you could not let other companies and parties into your kernel, all the better.
Sure. I get that stance. Yes. I do.
Yeah, I think that that's probably a genuine argument that, hey, look, we would have loved to have locked everybody else out of this, but we can't or couldn't. So I like this idea. I think it will be meaningful. I don't think it's just, dog and pony show, or I hope it will be meaningful. But yeah, that's happening today if you're listening to this when this episode drops Tuesday the 10th. So I'm sure there'll be some follow up activity around this we'll cover.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, not wanting to be too cynical, I do hope it leads to some kind of meaningful technology or process improvements and that all these organizations do come together with the idea of let's try to make the ecosystem more secure. I just am doubtful. But, the fact that the CrowdStrike incident was such a big one, and despite how much Microsoft may or may not be to blame for it, obviously CrowdStrike carries a lot of the blame for it. It doesn't look great for them. They don't want this kind of thing to happen again. So my hope is they're not just bringing people in to yell at them and look good for the cameras, that they will actually work on this problem.
You're extra curmudgeonly today. You guys listening, I'm going to have to work extra hard to get Drew out of the little curmudgeon bubble he's in right now.
I don't know.
Yes, everybody's going to hug. There's lots of trees in Redmond. They can go literally hug trees together. They can have trust falls, CrowdStrike, and Sentinel One. Yeah, they're going to all kumbaya.
Okay. Well, you know what? Maybe I need to be a little more positive, but so far reality is against you, JJ.
I know. Ever the optimist that I am.
Yes, it's good though. It's good. Moving on, researchers from the French security firm Quark's lab have discovered a backdoor affecting certain models of MyFair Classes smart cards. The vulnerability allows the RFID cards to be instantaneously cloned, allowing access to hotel rooms and offices worldwide. This is why it's hard to be cheerful, JJ.
I know, but can we talk about the security research firm again? Because I read this, my brain goes cork slab, like a slab of meat or a slab of marble, cork slab, but it's probably cork's lab.
I'm guessing, yes.
And then how do you do that with a French accent? Like, oh, cork's lab. We would just this for you. Obviously not like that.
Yeah, probably not like that.
Back to serious JJ here. So these cards are all over the place. The My Fair Classic cards, I don't even remember the year that they got replaced. I think it's been more than 5 and less than 10 since they got some updates into like the My Fair Plus and other flavors of this technology, but there's still a lot of them floating around. And I was kind of curious. I'm really interested maybe to even talk to a listener, somebody or that we find that works in this space because we follow these things when they come up, anecdotally. It's not the world we live in and understand inside and out, but it was pretty interesting to see because it looks like there are new versions of MyFair that are designed to be specifically backwards compatible with the older technologies to facilitate some modernization and enhance security, but that just hasn't been happening.
Right. Yeah, I get it. Hotels are sometimes a difficult business, and having to upgrade literally every door in the room and all the key cards is probably a significant undertaking. Although, of course, having your rooms broken into is not great for your brand. So,
Yeah, but it's not just hotels. If you start to go look at these cards, right, it's office buildings, it's probably government facilities. It's not a rare bird out in the contactless door entry system. Oh, my flipper is still sitting here. So I was just kind of curious. I think if you have a flipper, there's a sub gigahertz little menu in there you can click around. So I think you can read cards if it's not stamped on the outside or you can't see it for some reason. I think you can read the cards of the flipper. I think it should be marked on the outside as to which version, if it's My Fair, Classic or Plus or something. But definitely another opportunity to talk to, the organization, talk to whoever's managing access control for your building. If you're super nerdy like most of us are, you've got a device where you can scan with it or an SDR flipper or something, see what's happening there. If it is My Fair Classic, it might be worth having the conversation of, hey, there's some better technology that's backwards compatible. Let's check that out. Because, I mean, at the end of the day, these cards are not expensive.
yeah, certainly less expensive than a break in.
Yeah. And they did a really good job, I think, on the research paper. We've got that linked in the show notes here.
I read through it. It's, if you're not a cryptography expert, it can be heavy reading, but I do think they did a good job outlining the problem. I sort of got the feeling that it sounds like it's a fairly simple attack. I think simple to them is probably different threshold than other people, given all the math involved in this paper, but it is a serious thing that you should be taking care of.
So they did an attack. It took a while. It was a little intensive. So they basically made new versions of the attack and did other things to speed up those attack and kind of reduce the surface of what they needed to search for when there was kind of I'm air quoting here, like a search for something. They just kind of narrowed the scope down and then they optimized the attack further. So they were able to increase, the speeds, I think 5 and 6 times the original attack. But they also make the point that there's great opportunity in supply chain attacks because if the actual card producer or issuer, whoever's involved between that card coming off of a manufacturing, line into your hands, that somebody can most certainly do some damage.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think that's obviously, these one-off attacks are bad, but a supply chain attack where an entire batch of cards or one targeted at an entire, organization's lock controls would be very bad.
Yeah. And Curmudgeon Drew, you didn't like how happy the researchers were with their paper. What was up with that?
They just seemed kind of jolly about the whole thing, which is like researchers, when they hit on something that actually works, is a great moment for them. But this just feels like the wrong thing to be like, wow, look at this. Hey, isn't this great what we found? That was just kind of the vibe I got. Maybe it's them being French. I don't know.
Yeah. Maybe. On the other hand, we can all be jolly that they found it first.
Well, as far as we know.
As far as we know. Jeez, Drew.
I'm telling you, JJ, it's a bottomless well.
Sprinkle some optimism sprinkles over on you across the
All right, moving on. Wired reports that the U.S. Navy is testing Starlink satellite-based internet to give sailors access to the internet while at sea. It's not clear how many terminals have been installed on Navy vessels, but the website Defense Scoop noted in April that terminals were being tested on at least 2 ships. Apparently, the issue is that existing internet access from U.S. government satellites is slow and unreliable, and the Navy says that internet access can boost morale by making it easier for shipbound sailors to communicate with family and loved ones on shore, provide access to entertainment, get military benefits information, pay bills online, take classes, and so on.
I have so many mixed emotions about this.
Yeah.
So, full disclosure, My parents were both in the Navy,
Hmm.
and they were both on the military intelligence side, if you're okay with a little bit of oxymoron happening there.
Sure.
My dad was one of those people always deployed on cruisers and carriers. In fact, he was out at sea when I was born. So, there's one piece of me and I'm like, "Oh,
Right.
yeah, awesome." Because
It would have been nice for Dad to see little JJ.
yeah. You know what? I think all babies look like weird little aliens, so probably not. But, like, he didn't even know, it's like you have to get past, like, Morse code telegram level. It's probably not Morse code, but you know what I mean? Like, it takes a while, and it was actually not even the same day when he got the message. So, from this standpoint, I do think, because 'cause they're deployed for, long stretches of time.
Sure.
On the other hand, I'm kinda reading this, and my knee-jerk reaction was, well, what was it? Episode 27-ish? We covered a few weeks ago how Wi-Fi positioning systems enable mass surveillance, and we talked to
University of Maryland researchers, yeah.
yeah, who were actually at Black Hat giving that presentation, and we talked to him while he was at Black Hat. Awesome that he joined us. And one of the things that they were able to do was track military movement because of the Wi-Fi that was being broadcast through, the Starlink satellite systems, similarly to, Cradle Point and that type of thing.
Right.
And we think that particular issue has been resolved, but I'm kind of sitting here thinking, well, what else that's like that from a geo-positioning standpoint might pop up? Like, you don't want to just be advertising where everything is all the time, or maybe that's not even that much of an issue at this point because so much of the world has access to satellite technology. I don't know. I do think, though, Drew, it's actually a military version of Starlink, right? A whole military deployment of Starlink versus just like what we get in our RV camper.
Okay. That's good.
So there's that.
Hmm.
So I'm sure it's, secured and monitored differently. But yeah, I mean, so that's kind of interesting news and something I think to watch.
Yeah, I also have mixed feelings. Obviously, sailors should be able to video chat with their families and have access to entertainment and classes and all that good stuff. I can see how having good, reliable internet access would be great for morale. That makes perfect sense. I wonder, we always talk about separating IT and OT systems. How well is that done? And is this service also being used for things like weapons control systems, navigation, and so on? Because that also makes me concerned. And the third thing is Elon Musk as a leader. I think his behavior can be fairly described as erratic. So if I'm the Navy, like, how much do I want to rely on this guy? Like, I have a lot of questions.
Erratic is a very kind descriptor of his activities. Yeah, I did see a couple things because you brought up a point there. There was one comment, one of the links we have in the show notes. Oh, here it is. It says, quote from the article, greater broadband internet access to sailors to increase warfighter operational readiness through shipboard systems and use of personal devices over both military and non-military networks. Now, I'm just guessing this is one of those situations where maybe there's an Oxford comma missing or something just got misinterpreted. But yeah, it does kind of beg the question because there's this whole, yay, they have internet for families and communication and paying bills online. But the other part of this that they're talking about is supplying higher bandwidth to the internal operations, IT and OT,
Hmm.
to do things like download patching and get updates and run security scans and things like that. So it's not just for the men and women on the ships as users, it's also for the ship's operation. So I'm guessing, hoping maybe they've got that figured out. If not, I'm sure we'll have something to cover in several weeks from now.
Exactly. Well, we have a bunch of links if you want to go read on it yourself. And if you've got any experience and you want to weigh in, hit us up at packetpushers.net/FU. The FU is for follow up. And we do love comments, corrections, and just your feedback. Couple more stories before we wrap. The oilfield services company Halliburton says its systems had been hit by a cyber attack. Halliburton released an 8K filing with the SEC, which is now required by law, but the filing only noted that the company had detected an unauthorized third party had gained access to some of its systems, and that Halliburton took some of those systems offline as a precaution, activated its response plan, and notified law enforcement. There are no other details besides that.
Yeah, this is one of those that, I just cringe every time I see a real attack against, critical infrastructure, and there's so much critical infrastructure.
Hmm.
I mean, I think I'm a little bit repetitive when I say this, but if anybody's ever just tuning into one episode or one webinar that I ever do, it's not just utilities. Critical infrastructure is all of the things that are required for a community in a society to run. So it's healthcare, it's education, it's public venues,
Yep.
it's all of agricultural supply, transportations. There's just so much to it.
Hmm.
And I don't know who was attributed to this one, or if they have done an attribution yet. They're, a little more guarded when it comes to that type of target because you're talking about oil and gas. But it's cringeworthy to think that we're in a time now in 2024 and going into 2025 where we have nation state actors and we have entire governments like China who are getting ready to make some military movements, probably into Taiwan. I mean, they've already stated their intentions, right?
Yep.
And they've been doing a lot of things to distance themselves from us technologically, and they have been doing a lot of things to position themselves and have persistence within, in, or adjacent to critical infrastructure, remembering that critical infrastructure is like all of those things. And so it just kind of makes me pucker up because what is going to happen? They have already stated that their plan is to disrupt our society, our normal civilian society,
Yeah.
when they invade Taiwan to try to prevent the US from making a military defensive movement to keep them out of Taiwan.
Hmm.
So this will all bubble up and come to a head in the next, 2 years or so as this is playing out. Um, but a lot of times it's just the most basic, mundane thing, right? A lot of these attacks are not sophisticated. In the top list of 10 things we should do, a lot of times those aren't done. And it's stuff like default passwords or manufacturers make things that default into a unsecured state. I mean, this is why the government here in the US has so many initiatives around, secure by design and secure by default. But there's a lot of things we could be doing. And I wish I were in a position, probably like a lot of you guys, to just kind of volunteer a lot of time to help these people because sometimes it's perfectly preventable.
I mean, Halliburton shouldn't need volunteers. They've got plenty of money to do things right. But yes, it often is, that kind of eat your veggie stuff.
Yeah.
Get rid of default passwords. Make sure you're updating critical patches. Don't mix your IT and OT environments. Like, don't connect OT systems
Yeah.
to the internet, all that kind of stuff. We know what people are supposed to be doing. And for a reason, I mean, because it's humans working in complex systems, sometimes these things don't happen.
Yeah, I'll tell you too. I mean, on the OT side, this just boggles my mind sometimes because you have these crazy mega operations, right? Operational technology and ICS systems where, like, forget IT for a second, forget enterprise IT. This is just all of the cyber physical things that are happening in like manufacturing or oil and gas or, wastewater treatment, power generation and distribution systems. These industries and these organizations are dealing in millions and billions of dollars sometimes per day or per week. For them to be down for even a little bit is not just disruptive to society. How do we all like having our power out or our water not on?
Right.
It's a huge revenue loss for them, for those that are, for profit organizations.
Hmm.
And yet you walk into these places with their multi-billion-dollar OT infrastructures, and they don't want to spend literally the $800 for a small ruggedized firewall somewhere. It's just crazy.
Right.
It blows my mind. And I think this is the challenge. And, typically and historically, OT and ICS has been separate from enterprise IT. I mean, a lot of the work I've been doing recently is helping enterprise IT security architects and CISOs offices fold in OT and ICS because they've been voluntold to do that. But it's a lot of education that we all have to go through on both sides because OT is not like IT. But anyway, I digress on that. But it's a simple problem with a not simple solution. I'll also kind of give a little pitch here. Michael Holcomb is a friend that you'll see with a heavy presence on LinkedIn. I share his stuff a lot. And he's done several and continues to do several free OT and ICS security training online. So that's another great resource and an asset there. And he posts stuff all the time about, appropriate nmap scans to use in those environments if you're going to try to do that. All kinds of just helpful things. So we'll put a link in the show notes and definitely go check that out if you're in a situation where you need to secure those assets.
Yeah. And I just want to make it clear, we don't have information on what kind of attack this was against Halliburton and what systems it affected. This could have been, is script kiddie still a term these days? Or it could have just been somebody who stumbled across some system and decided to take a poke at it. It could be nation state. We don't know. Halliburton's not saying. But I think your larger point stands that critical infrastructure relies on the internet, as does most of our civilization, and we need to secure it better.
Yeah, and I'm basing the eat your veggies kind of 101 level stuff off of one of the quotes that basically said, while the specifics of the attack are still unclear, it's likely it wasn't a highly complex operation,
Right.
much like incidents at Colonial Pipeline, Caesars, MGM, and Clorox. The interviewer is saying the attackers may have taken advantage of simple preventable gaps, which is typically what happens.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, you don't have to be a cyber genius. All right, our last story for today. The U.S. government is suing Georgia Tech over allegations that the university and a cybersecurity research lab within the university failed to comply with Department of Defense standards regarding cybersecurity controls, including not having anti-malware software on some endpoints. As a government contractor, the lab was obligated to follow the DoD standards. The government also alleges that the organization knowingly submitted a false cybersecurity assessment score to make it look as if it was compliant.
Yeah, this is a big no-no. But this is something I think is applicable to such a broad audience because all of the university systems and colleges all across the country, and I'm sure outside of the US, have relationships that involve federal funding. So in this particular case, it's, it was a research lab tied to the Department of Defense. There's also just regular, federal funding and programs where parts of the university environment might be in scope for some specific requirement. Along the same lines, they've also kind of recently said the US federal government mothership, as opposed to not just Department of Defense, the whole federal government is making some noise around, hey, most of the colleges and universities are getting federal funding for student financial services.
Mm-hmm.
So this has nothing to do with research labs and DoD. This is just straight up, are you getting federal funding relating to student financial situations? And where they're heading with this is that these organizations, the universities and colleges are going to have to adhere to CMMC guidance, which is related but a little bit different than this. It's related to NIST 800-171. If you want to go look that up, that's what CMMC is based on. But this is one example that's kind of extreme, but it's, I think, going to be trickling out to a much broader audience in very meaningful ways, which means I think a lot of our listeners are going to be in a situation where they're being told, hey, we need to do whatever. In this case, it was, you said didn't have anti-malware on endpoints. It could be a network configuration. It could be a configuration and application. So there's all kinds of requirements for all parts of an IT environment that I think we're all going to have to deal with, not just the US government.
Yeah, for sure. It seems to me like the big boo-boo here was knowingly submitting a false cybersecurity assessment score. Like you could make a case like, yeah, we know we were supposed to have malware on some of those endpoints, but XYZ, maybe we had compensating controls, whatever. But if you're just misleading the government on your cyber assessment score, that's not a good look.
No.
No.
Yeah, especially the Department of Defense. Come on, people.
Right.
Now, because I'm optimistic, I always like to give people the benefit of the doubt.
See, I was trying there. You see how I did that? I said compensating controls.
Yeah, you did try. You need to try harder. But it underscores, I think, this need for communication. I mean, last week we had the interview, we had Yvonne on as a guest. She talked about communicating, risk and security in business terms versus, technology terms
Mm-hmm.
and kind of aligning more of those of us that like blinky lights with those of us that like policy and GRC stuff. And I think this is another, again, when we pick the news topics, it's not just here's something that's happening this week. We think this is going to fundamentally change something for you moving forward. And this is one of those things. I think we have to do better about communicating. I think we have to do better as technologists about not being defensive and just kind of listening to take something in instead of listening to respond to it and be ready for, we're not doing something that we need to be doing at the level we need to be doing it. How do we collaboratively work together and come up with a solution to meet this objective, whatever this is? In this case, a Department of Defense standard, it could be a federal standard, it could be something else, a compliance requirement.
I think that's a great point because a part of the story is that the government got wind of this because two whistleblowers who worked at the university in the lab went to the government with this information because they first tried to communicate to folks inside the organization like, hey, we're supposed to be doing these things, right? We're out of compliance here. We need to take these steps here. We should do this. For whatever reason, they didn't get heard. So they did go to find somebody who would listen to them, and that happened to be the Department of Justice. So if listening makes your eye roll sometimes, you're like, oh, yeah, I know I need a little bit. Take it a little more seriously. Communication really is important in this environment.
And kudos to whoever stepped up and did that because it's not about tattletaling, it's about protecting our assets, your corporate assets, your government assets, whatever you're tasked with. It's the role. And if you don't like that role, then go find a different one in a different organization.
Yeah, yeah. And for folks who may not know, Georgia Tech is a top research university in the US. So I'm sure they're working on very interesting and sensitive things.
And let me throw this out there for your consideration as well, because you made the whistleblower comment. The CISSP certification and really any of the certifications by ISC2 or similar type of organizations have, a code of conduct and ethics And there's actually at ISC2 an entire ethics committee that's built into the charter of the organization of the membership. And you are not allowed as a professional to see something like this happening and to not say something. It is your duty when you get into these programs. So I don't want to overstate things like that, but we do have ethics and moral expectations of security professionals. So that is something you should subscribe to, even if you're not holding those certifications, that we have a code of ethics to adhere to. And knowingly falsifying or contributing to or not accurately providing the information to the people who are validating those controls is definitely harmful. So don't, I think that the message for the practitioners here is it's much better to just go internally and say either I messed this up, I didn't do this, I didn't know, or oh gosh, I just realized we have this gap, than it is to try to hide it and cover it up, make people think that that thing is in place.
Yes.
And find out it's not. I mean, the number of times I've gone in, because, so much of my work is between the networking team and the CISO's office. The number of times I've gone in the CISO's office and the compliance and risk team has told me, oh, our infrastructure is set up like this. This is our architecture. This is how it's secured. And then I look at the actual infrastructure with those teams, and that's not how it's set up and working and secured. That happens probably 70 to 80% of the time.
I'll just add on to that. If you are going to do the right thing and that puts you at odds with whatever institution you belong to, make sure you have documented all your attempts to do the right thing first. Make sure you've put it in emails, make sure you've got it in writing somewhere, and make sure you can still get access to it, because the default response from an institution is protect itself, which could mean turning you into the enemy. So just keep that in mind. If you are going to do the right thing, document.
Yeah, and you know what? I'll go ahead and I'm gonna lay this out there because it's been long enough, and I can do this in a way that, names change to protect the innocent. We had a security project where we were, acting as a virtual CISO or a fractional CISO for an organization that was federally funded that worked in healthcare. And they had a partner that was not us, that was managing pieces of this infrastructure. They were starting to take on a new responsibility and relationship with the federal government, and they were not open and transparent and honest in one of their reports they filed to be able to move forward in this program. And I had to have a very serious conversation with the president of this entity that was a customer of ours. They and the partner and the other people they had outsourced to wanted to continue down the path that they were continuing down. And we had to make the judgment call of, look, as the CISO who is signing our name at the bottom of this paper, we can't. And this is a huge, lots of money dollar project, right? We had to let ourselves be fired and walk away from that and go, we can't do this. We won't do it.
Jeez. That must have been a tough decision.
Yeah. But you do what's right, not what's easy.
That's a nice note to wrap up on.
Yeah, I like it.
There you go. All right. Well, thank you for joining us for this episode of Packet Protector. If you've got a topic you want us to cover, you can find us on LinkedIn or at packetpushers.net/community, where you can join our free Slack channel with other IT and security pros. Got a comment, a correction, or question, you can reach out to us at packetpushers.net/FU. The FU is for follow-up, and we appreciate when listeners reach out. Eat your security vegetables.